Good morning, members of the GLAMs. I hope the sound of my voice finds you all doing well out there. Thank you so much for joining me for this keynote presentation. It's such an honor to share this virtual space with you today. I am recording this keynote for this year's DLF Forum on Friday, October 30th. It's just a few days before the 2020 election. So by the time you listen to this talk, we will most likely be dealing with the potential fallout from the election results. That's if the final count has even been completed. On top of the outcome of the elections, thousands more precious lives will unfortunately be lost to COVID-19. A disproportionate number of those will likely be Black lives, and we will be continuing to deal with America's foundational problem of racism, irrespective of who our next president is. So, in the midst of these precarious times, I'd like for us to grapple with a very important question. Do Black lives matter in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums? So I'm a historian and I'm a journalist who likes to write history. I often like to travel back in time and dig through archives to find answers to challenging questions. I like to search for historic touchstones, moments that might be able to offer some context, guidance, perspective, and a closer look at our shared humanity. So I'd like to begin by sharing an old poem for you. And I bet most of you will probably recognize it. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our cursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What thou before us lies the open grave. Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying while fighting back. This poem, If We Must Die, was written in 1919 by Claude McKay. He was a Jamaican-born, British-trained chief poet of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, some of you might be wondering why I read this poem for you. While I was thinking about this keynote, McKay's poem came to me because, quite frankly, most of us are thinking about the death of our democracy right now, as we have thousands of people dying around us, and while Black people continue to be victims of acquitted, state-sanctioned serial murder. Now, in 1919, America was in the third wave of the influenza pandemic. Hospitals were overloaded with patients. In some cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, bodies lay along the streets and in morgues for days. It was a horrible scene. It was a public health nightmare. Quarantines were imposed by some communities. Folks were ordered to wear masks. Schools, churches, and theaters were shut down. Businesses in the service and entertainment industry suffered double-digit losses in revenue. Drugstores and other businesses that specialized in healthcare products saw an increase in their revenues. Since bed rest was prescribed by doctors to treat the flu, there was actually a surging demand for beds, mattresses, and springs. College football games were canceled. Public funerals were banned. Libraries stopped lending books and closed their doors amid debates about whether the flu could be transmitted through the circulation of books. Museums closed down for weeks. Some museums and art galleries were actually converted into large hospitals, while some others provided things like story time and lessons for school children. Like today, the country at that time was being led by a racist president, Woodrow Wilson, who was the defender of the Ku Klux Klan. Fine people who he said were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, who were only defending the southern states against interracial governments and ignorant and inferior Black people who were trying to put white people under their heels. White supremacists actually packed DC to celebrate his election with shouts of Dixie. Now Wilson, like Abe Lincoln, who Donald Trump likes to cite when crediting himself for all he's done for African Americans, believed that racial equality was unnatural. He surrounded himself with racist political allies. He purged Black appointees from federal positions. He even implemented anti-Black segregation policies. So Claude McKay's 1919 sonnet was prompted by this political upheaval, by racial upheaval, by the events of the Red Summer. There were race riots in more than 36 cities across the United States. Hundreds of Black people lost their lives to white supremacist terrorism. On the heels of World War I, Black soldiers had come home with heightened expectations for racial equality, labor rights, civil rights. They were also intent on defending their bodies and communities against mob violence. The great civil rights activist and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about this moment in the Crisis magazine, which was the official hub of the NAACP. This is what he wrote. By the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses. If now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. So we had the scourge of a deadly pandemic, race riots and lynchings, a racist president, retrenchment on diversity and civil rights gains, and Black people having very serious and contentious internal conversations about armed self-defense. The parallels between the past and our current moment are they're undeniable. So there was Claude McKay writing that poem in that context. He captured in 14 lines the race-charged atmosphere of that era. He was certainly entertaining some dreadful thoughts. Quite frankly, you could interpret "If We Must Die" as a kind of murder-suicide note to America. But what he did was create a powerful archive of expressions, sensations, emotions, fears, and hopes, the desperation of a people fighting for liberty, fighting for the preservation of their Black lives. Oh, McKay made it to the other side of the pandemic. He survived the race riots without committing murder-suicide. Some years later, he wrote a letter to his Puerto Rican friend, Arturo Schomburg, at 321 West 136th Street in Harlem, to ask him to be part of a group of Black American artists, writers, intellectuals, and activists dedicated to studying, collecting, and preserving archives on Black lives in the United States and throughout the world. This is what he wrote to his friend. Dear friend, several of us have agreed that we Negro writers can be of mutual assistance in carrying out our unique and especially difficult responsibility of interpreting the life and problems of Negroes, not only here, but throughout the world. We feel that by working together in an organized way, we might be able to help each other to clarify our thinking, to improve the conditions of our work, to get closer to the problems of the masses of people, and generally to solidify our position and improve our stature in the world of letters and of thought. We agreed that you, of course, should be among the original group in deciding upon the soundness of this idea and how it should be carried out. Ladies and gentlemen, what this archival evidence reveals is that Claude McKay and other Black historical figures incorporated a collector, a librarian, an archivist, a curator into an early 20th century movement for Black lives. Their work was radical. Arthur Schomburg's collection of poetry, literature, art, oral histories, moving images, sound, and other materials, including Claude McKay's manuscripts and papers, became the basis of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which was established in 1925 in Harlem. Now, Harlem was the Black capital, which was a kind of utopian breeding ground for the explosion of intellectual and creative output for the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem at that time was a meeting place for Black people from all over the world. They saw themselves as members of a world community with a common heritage, but seeking to define themselves in new ways by engaging in a rediscovery of their origins and culture and contributions to history. The new Negro had been born. A new race consciousness was in the air. There was heightened interest in books, paintings, photography, oral histories, and other materials about Black lives. But books at the local branch at 135th Street were deteriorating for overuse. Many titles were either in private collections or had gone out of print, and there wasn't adequate funds to purchase available titles. And yet still, this small collection of historical figures understood the importance of having collections, archives, and institutions that provided fact-based, scientific, humanistic appraisals of American race relations. McKay and other Black intellectuals and artists saw Schomburg and his center as the keeper of knowledge, so that Black people's stories would not be erased. They wanted to show that Black people's lives mattered, that they were not inferior, that they had a rich history and a culture, that they had a sense of pride and place in American society, that they had a strong desire for literacy and intellectual growth as keys to freedom. And they wanted acceptance just like everybody else. They didn't have a whole lot of resources, but it was an optimistic moment full of opportunities. These Black bibliophiles, from Arthur Schomburg to Charles Wright to Margaret Burroughs to Jessie Carney Smith and Anne Shockley, understood the importance of collecting and housing what Black people wrote and created. They took seriously their role as preservationists and communicators of the story of the Black freedom struggle. They were fully cognizant that Black people were and have always been at the center and an indispensable part of what happens to our democracy. And so despite having few resources, despite the chaos and uncertainty of the historical moment, despite all the death and violence around them, they rolled up their sleeves and they got to work so that a whole century later, we would have a history, a rich trove of evidence to look back and reflect upon. They knew that losing the memory of a people, a local community, a movement, a nation, a civilization is a terrible thing. So here we are a century later. We're facing dark times. The United States is heading the wrong way, and the pandemic has accelerated that misdirection. The moment we are in is particularly dramatic and significant in the history of our nation because this is about the nature and survival of democracy. The glams of all types are reevaluating the role they play in preserving stories, the role they play in their local communities. They're questioning how to provide equal access, how to amplify the voices of the unheard. They're increasingly seeing information as a social justice issue, understanding its centrality to education, employment, and civic participation. Some are beginning to take seriously the work of dismantling institutional racism within their own organizations, but they're also grappling with how to pay for historical correctives, and what they say is now obligatory. There's a lot of self-critical reflection going on in these spaces, but the money doesn't always match. These days, if you attend just about any disciplinary association meeting or academic conference, folks seem to be oriented to serious contemplation on race and diversity and what it means. But is this contemplation genuine? Is it virtue signaling? Or is it yet another level of profiteering in the diversity industry where folks get to be celebratory and politically correct, pay homage to transgressive art and the importance of race, engage in edification and appreciation without any structural change in their institutions? One big takeaway from the pandemic is that college faculty and university-based libraries and archives are learning that we need to be ready and equipped to educate students and provide research materials to scholars remotely. Things have to be accessible digitally, but we also have to ask, what difference does this make that we are digitizing things? How is the power to be used to protect documents when we may not know their importance? What about the digital divide and access to these materials? Digitization is not the end all and be all. There still has to be some work done with paper. Now, I'm a huge fan of digital archives. They allow me to access materials and write more quickly, but I also believe that you can't digitize everything or else researchers lose the serendipity of going through a collection to see the synergetic connections in the files. The business of digitization is promising, but what it also does is that it abbreviates the way we understand things. As a college professor who teaches digital media literacy and digital storytelling to journalism students, I can testify that tweeting, Instagramming, Facebooking, much of the activities in the social media universe is alien to the flow of time and the subtleties involved and nuances of research and understanding. I'm deeply concerned with the erosion of literacy and research skills among new college students coming from a K-12 world where they've been disabled in terms of critical thinking, writing, creative freedom, and from digital addiction, which has literally altered the physical architecture of their developing brains before age 24. Students don't really understand things until they understand the full context of preserved knowledge. So, educators and members of the GLAM, we cannot abandon our traditional role of being their guides. Sure, my students love that they can ask a question and have answers pop up right away on Google or some other search engine. They're not spending years with their fingers in boxes or pulling out drawers. They don't experience the tactile value of touching books and files. Just the other day, during one of my digital tutorials where I was teaching students how to create interactive timelines, a few of them chuckled when I asked them to take out a piece of paper and a pen to begin our planning process. Y'all should have seen how many students on that Zoom call turned over bed sheets, left their rooms, yelled downstairs to their mamas in search of paper. One of them actually had the audacity to enter the chat and said, "Really, Dr. P? Paper? What's that?" And I sat there thinking, now I'm a Gen Xer on the cusp of being a millennial. They call us Xennials, actually. Should I feel old right now? I wanted to mute my microphone and camera while I clutched my chest and caught my breath. So I have to push these digital natives. I have to say, even though you got the page you wanted, how did it come about? There's a history to it. Somebody behind the scenes made choices about what information would be digitized, how things are cataloged, the order in which they're placed on shelves, and their accessibility is of critical importance. All of this is of critical importance. And so we don't want to lose background. There's a danger to losing background in context in all this new technology. How the knowledge came about is as important as the knowledge itself. This is what I tell my students over and over again. The pandemic has also separated students from each other. A lot of the learning that takes place is students teaching each other and working collaboratively on projects. And much of this has traditionally taken place in libraries and labs, which are now closed on many campuses. Another big problem with campus-based archives is that students at the undergrad and even graduate level rarely use them. That's because instructors often don't require students to do research using primary source materials. Now, I've surveyed both undergrad and grad students and have been stunned by the number of students who've gone through 4 years of college without checking out library books or visiting special collections, and those who've earned whole PhDs in the humanities without visiting the archives. And you'd be surprised to learn how many faculty haven't done primary research. So I would argue that at the university governance level, there should be a policy that says faculty will teach students how to do primary research, and there needs to be greater collaboration between faculty, curators, and archives to form ongoing relationships with each other. Libraries, archives, research centers, and museums on campuses need to get out of their silos and become more activists about pushing campus administrators for more support, funding, and prioritization. There needs to be annual seminars at the faculty level. Faculty members who have become adept at using the archives have to become champions of the archives and talk with deans and administrators about funding to gain support from provosts and presidents who often know very little about their own libraries, archives, and research centers. Now, I should acknowledge that it is difficult to ask faculty to be champions from the ground up, since nearly 80% of instructional faculty nationwide are contingent professors or adjuncts who are often cobbling together jobs at different campuses to eke out a living. Most struggle to produce research, which I would argue is precisely what some state legislatures want. Faculty are operating in a climate where conservatives have continued to portray colleges as beset by leftist tyranny and liberal excess. As such, professors and public intellectuals of color especially are suspect and have become visible targets for neoconservative racial projects whose purported mission is to reform higher education's alleged tendency toward hating America. The corporate takeover and colonization of academia by right-leaning forces has brought amped up attacks on tenure, research, academic freedom, Black and ethnic studies, and student and faculty diversity efforts. State legislatures have divested from public education. As such, universities are increasingly anxious about preserving what little funding is left. This gives legislatures, which because of gerrymandering are more right-leaning, gives them greater power. Because universities, both public and private, are so dependent on tuition and donations, the dollar is powerful. So when faculty of color are attacked for their research, the facts are irrelevant because the university's mission is to protect the bottom line. This gives more power to the racist oligarchy and all its constituents operating in an ecosystem of hate. So it's no wonder that funding for the very libraries, archives, and research centers that serious scholars who write about race are being systemically malnourished. Demography is also important here. We have to acknowledge that as Black people finally got into higher education and their numbers have been increasing in enrollments at the undergrad and grad levels over the past 40 years, along with other students of color, we simultaneously see the shrinking of tenured faculty, the adjunctification of higher ed, financial divestment, and soaring student loan debt. So we have to ask, who's going to have the institutional power to say to university administrators and state legislatures that we need to preserve history, that we need funding, that we need investment in the GLAMs? Who is going to defend the existence of the GLAMs and their funding? This conversation isn't just about making sure that Black lives matter, but making sure that archives and research centers, galleries and museums exist so that Black lives can exist in them. The dollar also rules in the world of galleries and museums. Private galleries that are dependent on people walking in off the streets and aren't backed by large institutions and donors face being shut down permanently in this moment. What's going to happen to GLAMs not being used or maintained right now? Once reopening happens, will there be a scramble to bring them back up to speed, especially those who have let go of so many staff over the past 8 months? How do libraries and archives provide undigitized primary source materials to researchers whose contracted books, documentaries, and films can't wait until reopening? I recently learned about all the serious debates going on right now about de-accessioning in galleries and museums. You may have seen some of the headlines. Western museums have a surplus of art by white men. Now some are selling it off to correct their historical biases. Baltimore Art Museum to sell paintings for diversity initiatives. The Everson votes to de-accession Pollock painting to diversify its collection. San Francisco MoMA announces de-accession to benefit the acquisitions fund and strategically diversify the collection. Some argue that letting go of these valuable works by white artists is a good thing because it improves the diversity of their collections, promotes inclusion, addresses historical gaps, attracts more traffic to new works, helps continue operations financially, and helps galleries and museums stay relevant. It demonstrates that galleries and museums recognize that Black Lives Matter, that representation matters. But some argue that these museums are motivated by profit and aren't doing the right thing with the funds. Some accuse museums of mortgaging their history to cash in on current fashions. That letting go of these items is also unethical. There are conversations around the destruction and removal of statues of racist heroes. So can we preserve racist artifacts and condemn white supremacy at the same time? Does art really have to do with the people who created it? Does de-accessioning key pieces of art that influence millions of people disrespect the public trust and dishonor the donors who gift and bequest works to ensure long-lasting legacies? Visions change. So how do museums reevaluate their holdings in order to keep up with new perspectives? These are serious questions also about gentrification and how it's affecting libraries and the future of libraries and the public space, especially in cities where local branches are planning to sell to developers because they don't have the funding to evolve their spaces. Do libraries have a duty, a responsibility to fight gentrification, which is displacing Black and Brown communities and erasing the existing cultures of those places? Libraries that want to diversify their staff have a difficult time hiring folks who can't afford to live in these cities with high rents or have the transportation to get to these places of work. There's acknowledgement that 20th century libraries were places that performed loaning books and provided quiet space for reading. It was all very basic. They're currently not designed and built for modern day services. Public funds are increasingly harder to come by. So many of these places, they can't repair roofs, leaks, air conditioning, boilers, and broken and outdated elevators. So they're devising plans to sell libraries to developers. Now, I've used libraries in large urban cities and small townships. And what I've seen in some places are libraries where most folks are on computers, searching for jobs, filling out applications, looking for social services. For homeless people, they've become sanctuaries from streets that can be cold, wet, and dangerous. Public libraries have also been engaged in efforts to address the opioid epidemic by offering trainings to library staff on how to administer Narcan to overdose victims. Global warming is posing an increasingly severe threat to archives, libraries, and museums. I've conducted research in places where there's mold. I've had to bat away mosquitoes. I've seen silverfish feeding on paper, book covers, and binding paste. That's because we're getting more severe rainfall that's finding its way into buildings through defective roofs, walls, and drainage systems. Most libraries and archives at historically Black colleges and universities are increasingly at risk of degradation caused by temperature changes, humidity, sea level rise, storm surges, and precipitation. At Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Research Center, where I've been spending a lot of time gathering primary source material for my next book on the lynching of Black children during Jim Crow, I've opened folders and seen news clippings from 70, 80 years ago literally crumble when you touch them. I was given a tour of the vertical files and other collections. It's vast, it's amazing, it's heart-stopping. There are books written by African Americans going all the way back to the 19th century that nobody else has, not even the Library of Congress. These books are sitting on old, dusky shelves, covered in a large sheet of Home Depot plastic taped at the edges of the wall. They've got thousands of old newspapers from local Black communities sitting from floor to ceiling and locked away in a room with no temperature control, waiting to be digitized, but there's no funding. And it's so heartbreaking because it's all at risk. One storm, one bad leak could just erase it all. This isn't just happening to Black archives at HBCUs. It's happening throughout the diaspora. If you travel to, for example, the W.E.B. Du Bois Center for Pan-African Culture in Accra, Ghana, you'll see that the archives is not in good shape. The center houses an original copy of W.E.B. Du Bois's 1899 Philadelphia Negro study, which is falling apart. A Black colleague and prolific researcher friend of mine quipped that when he saw the study on one visit in that condition, it was the only time in his life that he seriously wanted to steal something to save it from degrading further. The consequences of inaction will lead to damage to a diasporic archival infrastructure and degradation and loss of Black community history and the destruction of future history. And some of it is intentional. For example, in June 2020, The Guardian published a piece about how the British government has been systematically destroying historical records about its colonial history, stretching back to the early 1660s and the slave trade. These government-backed operations are an attempt to conceal and manipulate history in an attempt to sculpt an official narrative. The fear is that interpretations of the past that are based upon these records would make it difficult to celebrate the greatness of British history or deny the legitimacy of arguments for reparations. The GLAMs have the potential to be at the forefront of efforts to save this precious history and to dismantle racism in our country. But in a very practical way, the crisis of Black life in terms of healthcare, state violence, and other indices of disparity and suffering begs us to ask if there's an archival version of that too. Black collections at HBCUs and elsewhere speak to this neglect. Curators and other staff are playing their own part in this neglect based on the choices that they make regarding collection and processing and digitization of Black materials in terms of funding and fellowship programs and training and hiring of staff. Now, we can easily rebuke the racism of a white nationalist president. We can easily condemn a police officer who kneels on the neck of an unarmed Black man until his life leaves his body. We can condemn the police killing a Black woman sleeping in her home. We can condemn racial disparities and state-sanctioned violence. We can raise our voices against the violence of gentrification. But is there a version of this kind of erasure happening in the GLAMs, where there's still baked in inequality from a century ago? The fact is, there are few galleries and museums that actually explore the Black experience in America and throughout the diaspora. Sure, they exist, but how many of them are there? A dozen, maybe? Libraries seem to always struggle to have much of a holding related to Black people, written by Black people. And that's due to the ways in which they were originally and consciously set up. What we largely see is history as written by the victors mostly. There's a lot of redundant material available on white settler perspectives on things, but very few collections on indigenous and Black perspectives. These institutions reflect the ways in which white people colonize information, but also serve as gatekeepers of information related to themselves. So yeah, there's erasure. It's mostly researchers who have done the hard work of going to the original sources that we have to thank rather than official archives. When archives were originally set up, Black names weren't important unless they were attached to the names of an important white person who maybe owned slaves or was some kind of white savior to Black people. Early archivists wrote what white people said, and they wrote what Black people said to the extent that it was important to white people. So you have to dig really hard and creatively to find Black voices. Black lives matter to the extent in which Black lives matter to the extent in which researchers and contemporary historians and archives can stitch together pieces of the Black experience. So we're living in a watershed moment right now. Once again, Black people are at the center of the narrative. So we need to preserve as much as we can about what we're going through right now. Think about what you wish folks had collected in 1918 and 1919 and 1920. What do you think people would want to read about this moment 100 years from now? What's going to be important to them? What do you need to be collecting and preserving right now? Ladies and gentlemen, you are guardians of the past, but you're also guardians of the present. You helped to frame and establish how we got to this moment and what got us here. You lay the foundation for how future historians think about what we're living through right now. We're time travelers of the present and architects of the future, even as our gains have been under attack by unrelenting austerity. So, what is your role in this moment? Particularly when there's very little money to match genuinely stated commitments. What does this moment mean? How do we document it? Whose voices do we listen to? Who's going to be preserved at the expense of whom? Whose voices and whose culture is going to be erased? How will stories be arranged? With these new technologies, how do you use the evidence from this moment creatively on low budgets? Who should be the primary storytellers, particularly of the experiences of Black lives? As America rapidly turns brown, what does recruitment, training, and leadership within the GLAMs look like? What does the identity of your organizations look like? How do you stay relevant in the midst of these changes and an impending brown future? What is your role? I think your roles should be as the keepers of information, of diverse traditions, of cultures, without racial bias and whitewashing. Now, there's very real uncertainty with regard to budgetary issues, but I fear that some institutions may be using those legitimate concerns as an excuse to do nothing, to do less than what they've been doing. It's important for the GLAMs to make commitments now, even with the uncertainty. They shouldn't just pledge to do better, but to acknowledge where they failed and implement plans and strategies for the future to be inclusive and to be honest. There's nothing preventing the GLAMs from restructuring their institutions now. What is your role, ladies and gentlemen? Let me take you back into the past. Let's do a little time traveling to the early 20th century to introduce you to Miss Ernestine Rose. Now, white people often ask Black people, as if we could be both the doctors and the patients in treating racism, what they can do to be anti-racist. When I'm asked this question, it lets me know that a lot of white people are often unfamiliar with their own history, with the actions of white people from the past who were your first models for how to be anti-racist. Ernestine Rose was one of these people. I stumbled across a great essay from 1990 written by Betty Jenkins titled, a white librarian in Black Harlem. Now, I know a lot about the founding of the Schomburg Center and the key figures who were part of its origins and development. In college and grad school, I spent many a days in that place combing through research. But in all these years, I had never heard the name Ernestine Rose. Jenkins's essay tells us about this militant, confrontational, gangster white woman who fought against segregation in New York City libraries. How she saw the library as a social intelligence center that should be open to everybody and racially inclusive and appeal to a broad spectrum of users, the working and middle classes, the illiterate and the educated, those who would never think of coming to the library and those who came frequently. She genuinely believed that society could be reformed by educating its citizenry to be free of racial prejudice. The library could be a bridge between the races that could lead to mutual understanding. In 1920, the year after Claude McKay wrote If We Must Die, a few years before he wrote that letter to his friend Arthur Schomburg, who then founded his center, Ernestine Rose was a young white reformer who became the head librarian at the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. She would eventually purchase Schomburg's vast collection for the 135th Street branch, where she provided library services to Harlem's Black and Latino community from 1920 to 1942. Ernestine saw the library as a place that encouraged rational thought and a place to bridge understanding. She had previous experience working with Jewish immigrants and viewed librarians as the social workers in communities, helping new immigrants get adjusted to a new country, teaching English, and maintaining their customs and culture. It was also a place to promote racial pride, she believed. Ernestine was aware of her whiteness and cognizant that the community might harbor misgivings about her leadership because of her race. But she didn't shed tears. She didn't get all fragile and defensive. Instead, she hired Black and Latino staff to be visible at the forefront, at the front lines of the library's operations, to provide intimacy, outreach, and to promote the library's services. Now, she wasn't completely free of some of her racialized assumptions about Black people, but it's important to know that she didn't come into Harlem acting like a colonizer, a gentrifier, a missionary, a white savior, or an appropriator. One of her principles that she emphasized to library staff in their interactions with the community was this. She said, she would repeat this to her staff: nothing must be alien to you, peculiar, or even picturesque in the sense of curiosity. Ernestine believed in the importance of having an integrated staff, and she embraced shared governance with the community. She turned to community leaders to help plan policies and programs that were relevant to the needs and interests of the community. She involved Black leaders who knew Harlem best to plan, to organize, and promote programs. She had a symbiotic relationship with the community. She believed that the library served as both a teacher and an affirmer of the community. And because of her efforts, that branch at 135th Street was vibrant and bustling. It became one of the top 5 performing libraries in New York City at that time. Lots of people came to meetings, art exhibits, music recitals, plays, book talks, forums on current topics, lecture courses. This was all regular fare. Circulation increased. So did the registration of readers. Ernestine took copious notes on what Black folks were reading. Fiction was actually low on the list. They preferred books on history, particularly W.E.B. Du Bois's Darkwater. And they were even reading white supremacist literature to understand how racists were building their distorted arguments of their humanity. She wrote essays that challenged racist stereotypes about Black intelligence by describing their reading practices in the library and highlighting the community's interest in a wide range of books. During the Depression, she secured funds from the Carnegie Corporation and Julius Rosenwald Fund. She sat at tables of professional library meetings and at conferences to promote an understanding of Black people, their contributions to American life, and their rights as citizens. She was a constant thorn in the side of white professionals who believed that libraries should remain segregated. Like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Alain Locke, and others who formed friendships with her, Ernestine Rose understood the urgency of the moment and her role as a keeper of information, her role as an advocate, her role as an activist. She recognized that Black people represented the touchstone for what it meant to be an American. This is something that she wrote in one of her essays. As public interest, curiosity, and sincere desire for information about the Negro have grown, there has been an opportunity to disseminate accurate facts and a growing demand for them by readers. This is the library's big opportunity, for it may help to inform both groups. It has the channels of information, and it may find the services and do its bit toward the righteous adjustment of America's least understood and most serious social situation. The great poet Langston Hughes said that Ernestine was a, quote, warm and wonderful librarian who made newcomers feel welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, Ernestine rolled up her sleeves and went to work. In these dark times, I want to tell you just a little bit about rolling up your sleeves as a Black Gen X journalist and researchers. Throughout my educational journalism and activist career, I've been fortunate enough to encounter people like Ernestine Rose and a larger biracial cast of folks working in the GLAM, people like you who helped my development as a writer, researcher, scholar, journalist, activist. I'm an adoptee who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s in an abusive family home. The only book that laid around the house was a Bible. My adoptive parents never took me to a library, a museum, art gallery. They grew up during Jim Crow when Black people weren't allowed to enter these spaces. As a child, I always envisioned librarians as these white women with buns on their heads, wearing orthopedic shoes and acting like old school moms who shushed people. But my journey would change that vision. I eventually ran away from home at age 12 and entered New Jersey's foster care system, but I was fortunate enough to earn a full scholarship to the Lawrenceville Prep School, which was a private boarding school down the street from Princeton University. School had a wonderful library. It was called the John Dixon Library. Every building on that campus was named after white men. All the statues, all the portraits were of white people. Nothing in that landscape or the architecture or the buildings reflected or validated students who looked like me. But I was so happy to be there at that school to get what I thought was a first-rate education. Plus, I was just way too bougie for foster care. So the John Dixon Library throughout the 19th and 20th century had served as a gentleman's reading room when it was an all-white, all-boys school. Faculty and students mingled there and held court. Now, I had for so long been told that children should be seen and not heard, speak when spoken to, answer when called. So I didn't really have the intellectual and verbal tools to hold conversations with adults or other kids who were really smart and had a lot of money. But I loved coming to that library. It was warm and welcoming. They had these big black leather chairs. All the local and national newspapers arrived each day. So did all the latest magazines. In that library, I got to know the all-female staff who worked there. Now, they weren't rich white women, but had come from working class backgrounds and were the first in their families to go to college. And many of them had degrees in library science. Those women showed me around the library because I was intimidated. I had never been in a place like that before. They taught me about the Dewey Decimal System, but also that Dewey was a racist and a misogynist. They taught me how to navigate the catalogs, how to find journals, what a periodical was, what a primary source was versus a secondary source. One librarian In particular, Miss Maureen Craddock took me under her wing after a particularly embarrassing and funny classroom experience. It was my first semester at the school. I was in English class. All the other students were white and had a much stronger writing and reading foundation to me. We were reading Walden Pond by Henry David Thoreau. So we came across this passage where Thoreau talks about eating a fried rat with good relish. So the other students were totally captivated by the phrase. And so they underlined it. So I underlined it too. I didn't get their fascination. I was just sitting there thinking, damn, white guys will eat anything. I eventually raised my hand. The teacher was delighted to see my hand go up because I hardly ever spoke in class because I was too intimidated. I looked at him with all sincerity in my eyes and I said, so this dude is in the middle of nowhere, right? That's right, Miss Patton, you've got it. He's reflecting on how society is changing all around him all of a sudden. Yep, exactly right, Miss Patton. And there's nobody else out there with him, right? Okay, so I understand where he got the fried rat from, but where did he get the relish? My classmates gasped and chuckled. The teacher removed his glasses, gently placed his hand on top of mine and said, Miss Patton, with relish means with happiness, not condiments like ketchup and mustard. So I knew that I needed to improve my vocabulary and learn how to read. I got frustrated while reading Virginia Woolf and Jane Austen and so many other white writers that were considered great and that students had to read and understand to prove that they were smart. So Miss Craddock took me up and down those aisles of that library and put books and essays and a thesaurus in front of me. She was my guide and she was invested in my intellectual development. She helped me understand context and how documents got made. She also made sure to order books by Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and other African-American literary figures to supplement what I wasn't getting in my assigned classes. I went off to Johns Hopkins, then NYU, then Rutgers for my PhD with a stronger foundation for how to read, how to ask deeper questions because of Maureen Craddock. When I got to grad school at Rutgers, my research life began. I'll never forget going into the National Archives as a research assistant, where I spent almost 6 hours trying to find a letter from a literate enslaved woman to her Union soldier husband for a book about African-American love. To hold that document in my hands sped up my heart and sent chills through my entire body. I also spent time in the Library of Congress's newspaper division. Now, when I first walked into that place, looking like No Child Left Behind, the older white women working there talked to me in a tone that suggested they thought I was a high school student. But when I explained that I was looking for the late 19th and early 20th century arrest ledgers for the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which was led by the great anti-smut reformer Anthony Comstock, they were taken aback. What are you working on? One of them leaned in. Well, I'm writing my dissertation chapter on the rise of racialized pedophilic pornography during the Progressive Era and Anthony Comstock's omission of Black children in his reform efforts. They took a deep breath and got over their initial shock. And then they got excited and just as vested in my research as I was. They loaded up carts with ledgers and other items that I hadn't even asked for. Every time I came back, there was something new that one of them had put a sticky note on for me to read. The story of Black children mattered to them. They were disturbed by the sexualization of these children and that they had been left out of Anthony Comstock's reform campaigns to protect kids. They wanted to know why. It mattered that I was there, a young Black grad student in that place to find answers. By my third year of grad school at Rutgers, I became a part-time project historian at the Montclair Historical Society. I was born in Montclair, but I didn't know much about it or my biological family, which lived there. I started something called the Black Montclair series because the Historical Society and its museum had for 40 years not bothered to tell the stories of Black residents who migrated from the South in the 1870s, or to tell the story of Israel Crane, the town father, who was also a slave owner. The museum and society had no relationship with the Black community. Black people never visited or volunteered. They saw it as a place for white folks to do hearth cooking and play dress up. But what I discovered about the museum, which was Crane's old house, was that it had once resided in the Black section of town. It served as a mission for Blacks who left Virginia and North Carolina in search of better lives in this northern suburb. By 1920, it was turned into an African-American YWCA and used for various social and civic functions. Black club women held classes there to teach women and girls etiquette and reading and writing. W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes and Booker T. Washington all spoke there. For a while in the early 1920s, the upper attic of the building was a dormitory for Black female students who could not live on Montclair State University's campus because of their race. The Historical Society had always been a strong advocate for local history, but had an unfortunate tradition of operating more like a collector of antiques than a museum or an archive that told a true and complete story of race in that town. All those elements of the Black past got lost when the Historical Society moved the house from the Black section of town in 1965 to a high section of Orange Road and filled it with antiques and artwork that offer a textbook version of the Revolutionary era. So what I did as a project historian was reach out to the local Black community, the churches, the oldest residents and leaders to gather archival material and oral testimonies. I had a budget of $2,000. That's it. And so for 1 month, we integrated the Crane House with physical and visual archives that told a more complete story of the experiences of African Americans in that town. Hundreds of people flocked to the Historical Society grounds to see that low budget exhibit. Trustees were surprised that so many people of color would show up to its grounds. But when that month ended, the Historical Society returned the items to the residents, moved all of Crane's old furniture back to its original position, and made no effort to build an archive within the Historical Society's library collection. And the series died without any real structural reform or genuine efforts to keep the relationship going with the Black community. So the house sits there today as an uncomfortable remnant of history for a town that has regarded itself as the epitome of a progressive suburban racial utopia. Meanwhile, the once vibrant African-American community that occupied the South End section of Montclair is near erasure thanks to white gentrification from New York City. And right along with that erasure, the memories and archives and artifacts are being lost. I also spent some time in the local library in Paterson, New Jersey, where a librarian in the special collections section sat with me as we searched through local papers which hadn't yet been digitized. We were in search of front page stories about my grandfather, who was a famous numbers kingpin in the 1950s and 1960s and had been murdered by members of the Genovese crime family. One of his killers was a relative of New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. The librarian actually grew up in Paterson. He knew the scene. He actually knew my grandfather. He explained the ins and outs of the Black underworld and its collaborations with the Jewish, Irish, and Italian mafia, and how it all intersected with police and political corruption in New Jersey during the Black Power era. Right there in that library, I got a lesson on mafia history that is overlooked by the Hollywood machine. And right there on that second floor of that place, it was a librarian who helped this adoptee search for self, search for the truth about my biological family's origins, which had been kept a secret from me. I found myself in the archives, my biological family's history, my community's history, the history of my race. It was in those places that I felt like my life mattered, that my story mattered, that the staff helped me ask questions about those documents. I was able to create a body of knowledge that didn't exist before. I felt like a magician in me was calling the past forth by interacting with it. It let me know that Black researchers make Black archives. I learned that the glams were all about freedom. I felt free to read, free to ask questions, free to access ideas, free to communicate, free to be a historical actor, free to solve problems, free to be a change maker in the world in which I found myself. I've been privileged, quite privileged throughout my academic career. I am the outcome, ladies and gentlemen, of positive efforts of people like you who taught me the importance of preservation with an open attitude toward humans, who they are, how they behave, how they describe themselves, and what their possibilities are. As a humanities scholar, I am interested in questions of demography, citizenship, government data, race, the construction of childhood, and public health issues. Because you all make these materials accessible, I'm able to bring all of this together in a very interdisciplinary way. You all have been powerful collaborators in my search for truth. So let me close by saying this. Every 100 years, we seem to experience a periodic cycle of upheaval in our country. We have to think and find opportunities in all this uncertainty. And as the GLAMs move forward to continue to make Black Lives Matter, we're going to need more money and resources, more investment, more special collections, more librarians who specialize in and focus on African-American research topics, more museums and permanent exhibits that focus on the Black experience, art, and culture. So I opened this keynote with a poem by Claude McKay, and I want to leave you with another poem written by him in 1921 called America. Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess, I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. Her vigor flows like tides into my blood, giving me strength erect against her hate. Her bigness sweeps my being like a flood. Yet, as a rebel fronts a king in state, I stand within her walls with not a shred of terror, malice, not a word of jeer. Darkly, I gaze into the days ahead and see her might and granite wonders there. Beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like priceless treasures sinking in the sand. In this poem, McKay expresses his love-hate relationship with America as a Black immigrant, but he also gives us an ominous warning about the death of the American empire. He also tells us that all civilizations end, all empires end. Everything is subject to decay and deterioration, which means that we all have to find opportunities in the chaos and uncertainty amidst the death and violence, and be brave enough, like Ernestine Rose, like Claude McKay and so many others, to roll up our sleeves, even if we don't have much, and create something new. Thank you so much for listening.